We do have a number of people tonight from all over the United States that we'd like to thank them for being here and welcome them along with our normal group of San Antonians. And perhaps we'll even be lucky to get a few Europeans this evening who are willing to stay up until 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning to be with us. But to get us started tonight, I want to tell you a little story of my own. And this is, I don't know, those of you who may know me know that I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in what is called coal country. And during the 19th and most of the 20th century, it was known as the anthracite capital of the world. We have a public service warning that okay, that's what we're having everything tonight. A barking dog, a public service warning. It's anyhow, my grandfather, this was called the anthracite capital of the world. And anthracite was the king of coals. It was very, very hard. It burned very, very long. And it also was really the most sought after kind of coal during the industrialization of the United States. My grandfather was a coal miner. And when I was born, he came to live with us to take care of me because both of my parents worked during the day. And I absolutely worshiped him. I mean, he knew how to do so many things and was so self-sufficient, along with the fact that he was a magnificent storyteller. And really, even not at the drop of a hat, but the drop of anything, he would launch into a story to my complete entertainment and those around me. Well, one day we were out in the backyard and we had a big shed out there where we used to store tools, fertilizer, bags of things that we use in gardening. And we also had a bag of birdseed out there. And the birdseed was for the bird feeders that we had all over, because my mother really loved seeing the birds flying around. So birdseed is not only attractive, though, to birds. It also is very, very attractive to field mice. And when we were clearing out the shed this day, out of the corner, all of a sudden, comes a little mouse running. And he's trying to get away from us. And I'm standing there with this big, heavy broom in my hand. And my first impulse was to smash the little mouse. But my grandfather held up one of his gnarled hands, as he had very severe arthritis when he got older, and his hands and knuckles were very swollen. And he said, "Stop." And I did. And he said, "Let me tell you a story about a little mouse." And so he began. Well, my grandfather, when he was a boy, and again, my grandfather was very, very old, so he would have been a boy during the latter part of the 19th century. He had a best friend named Seamus Sweeney. And he and Seamus were in absolutely, you couldn't separate them. They were closer than twins joined at the hip. And as they grew older, they tended to do the same thing. And when they're very, very young as 10 or 12 years old, they both went to work in the coal mines. And this was not unusual for young people then, even younger than 10 or 12, to work in the coal mines. And the coal mines were a very dangerous place to work at this time. There were no federal or state laws that protected the miners from getting injured or very often getting killed in the mines. They would go so far that the underground chambers where they dug the coal often had trapped gas in them. And they would go so far as to bring a canary down into the coal mines with them because the gas was tasteless and odorless. You couldn't see it, you couldn't smell it. And if the canary died, they knew to stay out of that chamber of the mine, a kind of rudimentary biohazard system, not very good for the poor canaries. But anyhow, after years and years of working in the coal mines, he and his friend Seamus Sweeney, one day there was an explosion in the mine. And this used to happen not frequently, but often enough. And it was a very, very scary kind of thing, because you could be trapped inside the mine from falling rock and other things, an explosion. And very often, as I said, this would end up in being people injured, or sometimes even people dying. Well, this one day, it was fortunate. They were on the other side of the explosion, the side leading up out of the mine. And mines not only are places where miners go, but they're protected places where a lot of animals tend to go. And guess who was down there? But a whole bunch of field mice. And as the miners came out of the mines to get away from the explosion and get away from the falling rock, the mice also ran alongside of them and ran towards the opening of the mine. And just as my grandfather and his friend Seamus got there, all of the mice had gotten out of the mine except this one tiny little mouse. And they had the same impulse that we often have when we see a mouse. Seamus was going to step on it and crush it. And before he did, the mouse looked up at him, and with the most pleading eyes that he had ever seen, kind of like a dog who is looking for a treat or looking to be petted. And Seamus looked down at the little mouse, and he decided to let it go. So the mouse came out of the mine, ran around the corner, and he was gone. The miners all escaped that day. Nobody was killed, and fortunately, not even were they injured. And then again, the next morning they went into the mines, and for years and years later. Well, the mines, again, this was in the mid-1950s, the mines were starting to play out in terms of not having enough coal to make it worthwhile to mine in them. And remember now, coal is the result of millions of years of vegetation falling on the ground, rotting, then being covered by volcanic ash and dirt and stone, and under enormous, enormous pressure. And there are really two types of coal that form from this enormous pressure. There's soft coal, which is called bituminous, and there's the king of coal, which is called anthracite that we told you about. Now, also, if you leave it there long enough and there is enough pressure on it, that anthracite coal over millions and millions of years will become diamonds. Yes, diamonds. Just like you put on engagement rings or fancy jewelry. Well, anyhow, Seamus and my grandfather retired from being miners and went their separate ways. Seamus went off to work on a little plot of land that he bought as a farmer. And my grandfather worked for my dad in a hardware store. And this went on, for many years. And as I said, my grandfather was very important in raising me. He would walk me to kindergarten and make my lunch for me, all kinds of things, and constantly telling me stories. But one day, Seamus is out working in his barn on his little farm. And he's putting up hay to feed his cows and the few goats that he had. Okay, it's harvest time, and he's getting ready to take care of them for the winter. And as he moves a bale of hay, what runs out behind it but this full-grown mouse? Now again, Seamus has a pitchfork in his hand and he's startled by the mouse running out. And he almost goes to stab it with the pitchfork. But something strange is happening. He looks at that mouse and the mouse looks at him and he starts to recognize the mouse, and the mouse looks at him and recognizes him. Well, wasn't it the same mouse that Seamus had saved all those years ago from the explosion in the mine? And the mouse just stood there. And the next day, Seamus went back into the barn, and the mouse was there again. And this time, the mouse kept moving him back towards the back corner of the barn. And so Seamus followed the mouse. And lo and behold, there behind a stack of hay was the biggest diamond that Seamus had ever seen in his life. And I guess the mouse, roaming all through the mines, had found it. And this he shoved over towards Seamus, and Seamus knew that the mouse was giving him a present of the diamond. And he took it and he sold it, and Seamus lived like a king ever afterwards. And as my grandfather looked at me when we were cleaning out the shed, after we let the little mouse go, reminded me that whenever you're tempted to hurt or maim somebody weaker or smaller than you are, remember, you may be throwing away the largest gift of your life. Thank you. We now will move on to our second teller, Karen Archer, who is a member of our San Antonio Storytelling Guild. And she's quite a storyteller. She would claim she is still in her developmental stage, but I've heard her many times, and she's a wonderful storyteller. So I will turn it over now to Karen Archer for our next teller. Karen?
Well, we have been talking about Texas this evening, and I will tell you that I grew up in a rural area. I grew up in South Dakota, much farther north and much colder country. I was used to wildlife when I was in South Dakota as a young person. I saw deer and coyotes and rabbits, of course, and snakes. My first encounter with a rattlesnake was when I was a teenager. I was hiking with a friend, and we came up on some thick brush, and we just parted for a few minutes. He went off around to the right, and I went around to the left, and then we were going to meet up on the other side. I had to jump down a little ledge, and then the path continued on the other side. As soon as I jumped down and my feet landed on the ledge, I knew I was in trouble. I heard the loudest buzzing of a rattlesnake den. And I kind of looked behind me, and I could see that I had jumped over a nest of baby rattlesnakes. I was in a bad situation. The baby rattlers were behind me. There was a 30-foot drop off to the left of me. On the right, there was this wall that went up about 8 feet to the ground above. And then it just kind of tapered off to this path that I had planned to go up. Well, the problem with that was that there was a large, angry rattlesnake between me and the path. I stood very still. I didn't move a muscle. My friend appeared up above and he put together a plan. And it was 1 in a million shot, but it was all we had. He found a large rock and he picked it up and he says, I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. And he threw that rock down. At the same time, I ran out of there. And it worked. He not only hit the snake, but he killed the snake. And I got a souvenir from that. I got a rattle off the end of that snake that had 10 buttons on it. It was a very large rattlesnake. Well, you know, I wasn't afraid of snakes. I had a healthy respect for them, but I wasn't terrified of them. Not like my boss at the engineering company. I was a bit of a trailblazer in those days, and I took a non-traditional job with an engineering company out on a land surveying crew. And I was outdoors working a lot. And on this particular day, I was out with one of the engineers, and he was deathly afraid of snakes. I was the rod person. I had the elevation rod next to me and I was standing and waiting for him to set up when all of a sudden he let out a yelp and he said, get out of there, get out of there. And I looked around. It was a bull snake. Well, I wasn't afraid of an old bull snake. Bull snakes eat mice, the bad mice, not the good mice, and they're a nice thing to have around. And I'd even handled bull snakes before. I wasn't afraid of them at all. Well, I couldn't help but play with my boss a little bit. So instead of running out of there while he was yelling, get out, I went over to the snake. And I told him how handsome he was and how pretty he was and what a large bull snake. And I just was admiring him stretched out on that rock all the time. My boss was saying, get out of there, get out of there. And we did eventually leave, but he didn't see the humor in it as much as I did. Well, my next close encounter with a rattlesnake happened when I was working for that same engineering company. And I was out looking for property markers one day. And if you know snakes, they don't like to be out in the cold. And this was late fall. It was too cold for snakes to be out. So I wasn't even thinking about them as I was walking the fence line in the tall grass, looking for property markers. And all of a sudden I heard that familiar buzzing sound. And I stopped, I froze right where I was, and I looked around and there was a snake, a rattlesnake. And he was all coiled and ready to strike. He was coiled up, his rattle was buzzing, his neck was up and his head was arched back and his tail was flicking, and he was within striking distance. I looked back to see how far the truck was. It was about a half a mile. And I thought I can make that just fine if I have to, if I get bit. And I knew I couldn't go too fast, but I couldn't go too slow. So I had that part covered. And then I had to think about how far it was to the nearest phone. It was years before cell phones. It was about a 5-minute drive to the nearest phone where I could raise the alarm and get some help if I got bit. Well, that was plan B. Plan B was in case plan A didn't work. Plan A was 1 in a million shot, but it was all I had. So I pulled myself together, and I pulled myself together, and I put everything I had into this one effort. And I suddenly shot up and shot backwards at the same time and landed on my feet. That snake struck out, but he missed me. Not by much, but he did miss me. That was my last encounter with a rattlesnake. The only snakes I've encountered since then are those little garter snakes, those cute little snakes that scurry off the path when you're walking. And that's just fine with me. That's the kind of snakes I'd like to encounter. Thank you.
But Nathan, maybe he has one too.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Nathaniel.
All right. Okay. Okay.
Tell him why.
Hi. I'm as you know, yesterday was my mom's birthday, and I wrote her a poem as a birthday present for her, and she loved it. When I was hoping to read it to you and share it with you, and I think you'll like it too. I call this poem The Real Best Day of the Year. What is the best day of the year? Most people say it is Christmas, but I think they're wrong. You will know what I mean at the end of this song. In my humble opinion, your birthday is the best day of all, because it is celebrated any day of the year in winter, spring, summer, or fall. All the holidays are great, Christmas, Easter, and Halloween, but on your birthday, you become the king or queen. 'Cause on your birthday, you can do anything you please. It is the day you can do anything with the greatest of ease. It is also the day when you get presents and eat cake. The more the merrier. That is no mistake. What other day of the year allows you to do all of that? No other. It is really worth a chat. Your birthday is also a day that you spend with your friends and play lots of games. The fun just never ends. What else makes your birthday so grand? You get to try something new. Try something you never did before, and it will appeal to you. But most of all, on this day, you celebrate the day you were born. It is the day you came here in the bright early morn. And that is why I say, jump up and cheer. Your birthday's the best day of all, because you are so happy you're here. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do now is to share some ideas that we've all put together on how to enhance your storytelling. Okay. All right. Well, tonight's little, what I guess we're going to call a mini lesson is about what is called foreshadowing. And the example I'm going to use tonight is a couple, young man, young woman, and all they're doing is they're in the basement of a building and they're walking through a door into a long corridor. And at the end of that corridor, there's another door. Now, when they first walk into the corridor has a very disgusting smell to it. It's like a combination of rotting garbage and mold. When you look at the shelves that line both sides of the corridor, the paint is cracked on the shelves. There are cobwebs on them. And the floor is all chipped and broken. And the place is very, very scary. As they continue to walk down the corridor, they look outside because there's glass above the shelves and they can see trees outside, but the trees are gnarled and wrinkled. And the clouds are very black and dark blue that are in the sky. And it's cold in there. And finally, after they walk down the corridor, they get to the end of it, open the door, and go outside. Now, another young man and young woman are in the basement of a building. And lo and behold, in the basement of that building, there is another corridor. And on one end, there's a door. And at the end, all the way at the end of the other corridor, there's another door. And the corridor on both sides has shelving. And above the shelving, there are glass windows that look outside. Now, as they open the first door and step into the corridor, they are splashed with sunlight through the windows that are above the shelves. On both sides of them, the shelves are lined with flowers, all different colors. And they are exuding the most wonderful smell. It is just, like the finest of perfumes that you would find anywhere in the world. The floor also is glistening again because the sunshine is bounding off all sides of this corridor. As the young couple walks down, they look outside, and in addition to the beautiful sunshine that's out there, they can see gently swaying trees and grass fields. And in the distance, they can see the ocean. And it looks so welcoming and it is so pleasant in there. And they just can't wait to get outside and go down to the ocean. And as they're halfway down the corridor, the young man reaches down and takes a hold of the young woman's hand. And she turns towards him and they give the most wonderful smiles to each other as they pause for a moment there in the middle of the corridor. And then finally proceed on towards the end and exit through the door to the outside. Now there's yet a third couple. And they're in the basement of a building. And lo and behold, that building also has a doorway. And inside that doorway is a long corridor. And at the end of that corridor is another door. And this corridor also has shelving on both sides of it and glass windows above the shelving. And as the young couple walk in, they're startled and they jump to the side because a jack-in-the-box is opened and out of it comes a little snake. Not a real snake, but a snake that has a spring inside of it. And just as they go to lurch to one side, there's a loud boom on the other and a firecracker goes off. And as they continue to lurch down the corridor, they are constantly shocked by one kind of a surprise or another. And they're very, very scared that something else is going to happen and they don't know what it is. And they're very anxious. And they look at each other halfway down the corridor. They turn to each other and there's terror in their eyes as they look at each other. And then they bolt towards the other end of the corridor and get outside. And as they open the door, the outside is a very twisted world that is out there. The trees are all bent sideways, and the grass is red. And they look down and they think what they're looking at is the ocean, but the ocean is purple. Okay. Now, what do we have here? We have 3 young couples, 3 young men, 3 young women. They're all walking into a corridor, having an experience while they're in it, and then walking out the other side. Now, how does that help us when we are hearing a story where this takes place, where each story is different? Each story has a different experience, different corridor experience in it. What does it do to the first one, the corridor that has the death smell in it, the moldy smell in it, that is really, everything is decaying and stuff? Do you think when we open that door at the other end of the corridor that we're going to end up at a birthday party where everybody is happy and having a good time? Absolutely not. The foreshadowing that we have done just in that short walk down this corridor prepares us for potential horror. Our expectations ready us for the next part of that story. The same thing happens in the second story where the young couple walks in and everything, just flowers are on the shelves. The sun is beaming in through the glass. The floor is glistening. The sun is shining on them. And everything is just wonderful. This is the corridor where the young man takes the hand of the young woman and they gaze in each other's eyes with a look of absolute pure love. What are we expecting to happen? Are we expecting when they open that corridor at the other end that we're going into a horror story? Absolutely not. Now, here's where we may be going into a wedding or a party. The earth is friendly, the corridor is friendly, the foreshadowing that we are getting to expect the next type of the story, the next kind of the story is there. And the same thing with the third corridor, the one where everything seems to be so completely bizarre and out of whack. And we have jack-in-the-boxes jumping at us and things falling off shelves and all kinds of jolting experiences. And we look out and we see that the grass is red, the sea is purple, the things are not as they should be. And this foreshadows that we're going to be in a bizarre situation in our story as we walk through the final corridor. And these techniques really help us to bring our audience into our stories and to enhance our telling. And there are a few ideas that we wanted to share with you this evening. I now see that our president, Sue Kuentz, is back, and I will turn it over to her to tell the next story. Sue?
Okay. Can you guys see me all right? I am
Yes,
on my
we can.
iPad in Colorado.
Okay. Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I was jumping from one Zoom to another, and I am so glad to see so many folks here. And John, I wish I could have come in on the beginning of what you were saying. It just was so marvelous. I had to walk into that room with all those terrible smells. Oh, so with that, there's a summer tale that I rediscovered that I thought might be kind of fun, especially being up here in the mountains where there's a lot of rain and lots of little monsters come out at night, whether they're small or huge. whether they sting or gobble you up. This particular tale is actually called The Wild Woman of the Woods. And I first heard it a long time ago, and I believe it was a Native American, I know it's a Native American tale from Oregon area, although I've heard it as a Texas tale also. So I'm telling you my version right now. Long, long ago, there was a young family in which this woman was getting ready to give birth to her third child, and they lived in the woods. And she was excited, and her children and her husband were excited, and it was about that time. So she called out to her oldest son, Neem, you must go now and find the midwife. Find her now, because your new little brother's getting ready to be born anytime. Well, Neem was excited. He looked out the window, though, and it was dark. He wasn't scared of the dark. He was the oldest brother. He would do anything to protect his family. But the wild woman of the woods, why, that story's been around. Oh, he started hearing that when he was just a baby. He knew you cannot go out into the woods by yourself, for that wild woman, twice of any large man with a long pointed nose, was told that if she caught you, child or adult, she would suck up your blood. And some children were never found. He knew that this was probably a child's story and that he should go with someone else. He would much rather wait and go with his parents. Well, his mother saw his fear in his eyes, and she pulled him up close. And she pulled her other daughter up and said, Neem, you hold your sister's hand. And that's like a bond. It's a bond that will not separate you at all. No evil will separate that bond as long as you hold your sister's hand. Now go to the midwife now. Well, he felt quite assured just by the tone of his mother's voice and knowing that he was going to have a new brother any moment. So he and his sister, holding hands, rushed out into the dark. Yeah, they were scared, but they'd been out before close to the home, and there was a breeze blowing and the leaves and the wind. You could hear the crackling of the dead leaves underneath their feet as they began jogging down their path now. And then those eyes, those animal eyes of yellows and orange and even blue eyes coming out behind all bushes as her eyes adjusted to the dark. And they were about halfway there when all of a sudden there she was. Where she came from, they didn't know. As if from the sky she appeared, they could see her tall, long, skinny body, that long, pointed nose, and the basket that they had heard about on her back. And she was getting ready to grab them, but Nee was holding his sister's hand tight. He saw the concerned face on that evil wild woman, but it was his sister who looked up at Neem and screamed. And once she did that, her hand released from her brother. And it was at that moment that wild woman grabbed that little sister and then grabbed Neem and threw them both into her basket. And it was dark in there, but there were other children also in there. And off that woman, they could hear her steps walking with purpose. And Neem just shut his eyes and tried to collect what would make them be free. He knew the calmness that his parents always talked about, and that he must clear his brain, and his vision needed to be clear, crystal clear. He could see doors opening in his mind. And it was from finding something that he had already, and he searched in that darkness of the basket. In his pockets, he found one sharp-edged stone. And then among the children, he felt the bottom of the basket, and he started using that stone and scraping away each piece of the threads. And eventually he was able to make a little hole. And then he whispered to the children to calm down and to help him stretch those cords one by one. And finally, they would be free. And the children, they listened to Neem's calming voice. And Neem's sister held on to him too in the dark. And with each one plugging away at that little hole Neem had created, eventually, one by one, those children escaped. Now that woman, she had since placed that basket down on the ground and was out searching for wood for her fire. Now she saw those children. She saw 3 of them. She didn't know if those were the ones that she had in her basket. But she, with a smile on her face, just ripped off pitch from the trees close by and threw them. That pitch landed right on the eyes of those children and blinded them. And she placed them back in the basket. Well, once she found her trail into the woods, Neem gathered all the children, the ones that had pitch on, and he gathered them closer and closer to the fire that wild woman was building. And as that fire was getting larger, those children, they hid behind the bushes, but the heat, even from those who were blinded from the pitch, the heat started melting that pitch off of their eyes. And Neem and his sister knew exactly what to do. They gathered that pitch from the children's eyes, and they made 2 round balls from that sap from the trees. 2 of the little girls who were in that basket went up to Neem and said that they knew what to do with the pitch. They had good arms. Well, Neem and his sister gave each one of them a rounded ball of pitch. And those girls were ready. And all the kids whispered together on a plan of action. And once they could see that wild woman coming back towards that fire with more firewood, they all jumped out of behind the bushes and screamed to her, "We're out! You old woman, you can't catch us. We're smarter than you." Oh, she was infuriated, and she was running toward them with her arms seeming to get larger and larger, and her nose, you could see the blood coming out of it. Those 2 girls that looked at each other with confidence, each threw with their left hand as hard as they could. One of those balls of pitch hit the left eye. The other ball of pitch hit the right eye of that wild woman. She was furious, for now she couldn't see, and she was just flailing those arms in all directions. Well, the children knew exactly what to do. They came all around her and behind her, and they pushed her into that fire. They were relieved, and yet they knew something was not quite right. Now, the midwife had heard all this commotion, and the midwife came quickly and ran and saw exactly what was happening and saw that wild woman. And the midwife gathered the children to get away from her as quickly as possible. But as they turned one more time to see these red embers flying up through the fire, they were not just red embers. They were that wild woman, but multiplying. They were small, but there were hundreds, no, thousands, 10,000s of these flying red embers with long noses, flying out into the hot heat of the summer's forest. The children could hear the buzzing sound of these little monsters. And they ran, and the midwife made sure they all got back to their homes. And stories were to be told, but that midwife, she already knew that there was a baby to be born. And so she brought Neem and his little sister, still holding hands, back to their home and delivered the most beautiful, most handsome little boy you'd ever seen before. Now, you need to know, Neem had a story to tell, so did his sister. In fact, those little monsters started landing on arms with a little bit of blood coming out. sucking the blood out. But Neem, that story he spread. In fact, when you're out on a summer night, whether you're here in Colorado or there in the heat of the summer of the Texas summer, and you hear that buzzing, and you select your arm, and you see that mosquito that you just killed, you'll now remember about the wild woman in the woods.
Okay, marvelous, Sue. As always, you are an expert storyteller and so entertaining. And I've always wondered where mosquitoes came from. I finally be able to tell the story. Thank you very much, and enjoy yourself in Colorado. We're so glad you could join us.
Thank you.
We're now coming to the time in our story concert where we want to give people who are part of our audience a chance to tell their own stories. And that's really what we exist for. We believe in our hearts that there should be a storyteller in every family. Going back in history, you only lived as long as you were remembered. And the storyteller who would tell your story was the most valuable friend or family member that you had, and would keep you alive through centuries. But in Tampa, and Jim, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the story that you share with us this evening? Go ahead, Jim.
John, glad to. My name is Jim Kissane, and I am a storyteller with the Storytellers of Old Tampa Bay. And my repertoire is personal stories, historical stories. In particular, I do quite a bit in terms of stories of industrial America from the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s. So that's where a lot of my background and material come from. And tonight I'd like to share with you a personal story. And it's going back to the late 1960s. I was an 18-year-old young man that was driving my first car, a car that my dad had co-signed for me. And although it was 1968, that was a new to me 1962 Corvette. And I was the most excited creature you could possibly imagine. And I was taking my first long distance road trip. I was going to visit a classmate that lived over in Clovis, New Mexico. Now, to get to Clovis from where I lived was about an 18-hour drive. But when you're 18 years old, you don't think about, distance and time and human limitations and things of that nature. And it turned out that I had violated all three of the cardinal rules that my father had tried so hard to drill into my head. Watch your speed limit. Don't drive when you're tired. And never forget to look at your gas gauge. It had been hours since I'd passed Amarillo, Texas, headed to Clovis. And if you're familiar with West Texas roadways in the late 1960s, from Amarillo to Clovis, New Mexico, is a long, straight, almost arrow straight road with no lights and no signs of civilization hardly anywhere. And it was the middle of the night. And no, I had not been paying attention to my speed. And I was starting to get a little bit drowsy when something appeared in front of me that scared me quite to death. You see, in the oncoming headlights of a vehicle that was going eastbound, and you've probably seen this happen before. Long, narrow, straight road, things that appear between you and an oncoming vehicle tend to get magnified. And what I was looking at in this magnified image in the wee hours of the morning were dozens of big, brown, hairy spiders that were crossing the highway. These things looked like they were 2 or 3 feet tall. They were monsters. Now, remember in the 60s, we grew up on monster movies and all of these stories about things that happened out west in the desert where nuclear tests created all kinds of abnormal species. And intellectually, my brain, if it hadn't been so tired from all the driving, might have figured out that, no, that's not what's going on here. And I couldn't possibly have known that about this time of year, every late summer, early fall, brown tarantulas migrate from Texas across the West Texas Panhandle to Colorado looking for a mate. But I didn't know that. All I saw were these big, brown, hairy spiders, dozens and dozens of them, illuminated by the lights of this oncoming vehicle. It was at that moment I looked down at my gas gauge and I panicked. It was well below a quarter of a tank. And the last gas station I remember seeing was way back in Amarillo. And what was I going to do? I couldn't turn around. I wasn't going to have enough gas to get anywhere. And that certainly wasn't the part of the state that I wanted to run out of gas. Not with these creatures out there. Then it occurred to me, I'm 18 years old. I'm driving a sports car with a big V8 engine. So I did what my 18-year-old mind said to do. I floored it. And as I was picking up speed, the most unthinkable thing, the most horrifying experience I've ever had in my life happened. The oncoming car that was illuminating the spiders turned off on a side road, leaving me on this unlit, desolate, 2-lane highway going through West Texas, just me and the spiders, and the 100 feet or so ahead of me that my headlights would show. But I couldn't give in. I blasted through the spiders, and when I got to the point where the spider crossing was, I'm hearing this thump, 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 thump. And a few seconds later, thankfully, the ordeal was over. And I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was only a momentary passing, because it was at that moment I realized that I've just run through an armada of spiders. I'm convinced that these things are on my roof, on the sides of my car, and underneath it, just waiting for me to stop. Where the moment I open my door, they're going to come in and get me. And I panicked. What am I going to do? It was 2 or 3 hours before daylight, and I was in an unfamiliar area, had no idea what was going to be ahead. And so I kept on driving, the sweat pouring off me, my hands on the steering wheel shaking like a leaf. And then I saw ahead of me a blinking traffic light. And it was a 4-way intersection with a single blinking traffic light. And at the intersection, there were 2 buildings. There was a small diner, and next to it, a Texaco station, neither of which was open. Almost as the answer to a prayer, I swung into the diner, turned off my car, just grateful that I had enough gas to get that far, and decided I was going to wait until the diner opened up. And when it did, I would run into the diner, a place of sanctuary, and maybe get some help. And in the hours that I sat there waiting for the diner to open, all I could think of was I'm hearing sounds, scritching, crawling sounds, and I knew that the spiders were out there. And about 5:30, a car pulled in behind the diner, and a few minutes later, the lights turned on, and the waitress turned on this open sign and unlocked the front door. Now was my moment. But what do I do? As soon as I open the door, the spiders are going to get me. And then I realized, dummy, you're driving a convertible. I reached up, flipped the latches, threw the convertible top backwards, and with a leap that Peter Pan would have endorsed. I was 6 feet away from the car and running across the gravel parking lot as fast as I could, up the steps to the diner, ran inside, plopped myself down in the nearest booth, still shaking like a leaf. The waitress came over. Hon, are you quite okay? Is there anything I can help you with? I told her I'd just like a cup of coffee. I had a little difficulty with my car, and she brought me over a cup of coffee and kept looking at me over the counter like, this poor lost soul, he's got some major trouble. About half an hour later, a scruffy looking fellow in coveralls with a Texaco baseball cap walked in, sat down on the last stool at the counter. She brought over to him a cup of coffee and his donut and said, Earl, you might want to talk to this young fella down there. It looks like he might be having some problems with his car. His name was Earl, and Earl turns around on his stool, looks at me and says, your car out there? I said, yes, sir. Well, what's going on with it? So I don't know. I think I felt something underneath it. Was maybe you could take a look at it. You got the keys? I said, yes, sir. And I tossed him the keys. Earl stood up from the counter, keys in his hand, looked at the car, walked down the front steps, went around to the driver's side, opened up the door, got in the car, and took off out the parking lot, screaming, when it hit the asphalt, a sharp chirp from the tires, gravel dust everywhere. And I realized I may not see my car ever again. Now I had a problem. How am I going to explain to my dad what happened in a manner that he's going to understand, let alone forgive, that I've lost my car and how I lost it and the circumstances, and it was just going to be a terrible mess. And as I'm bemoaning my fate, the sheriff pulls in, walks in, sits down on a stool and says, craziest doggone thing I have ever seen in my life. About 2 miles down the road from here, there's sharp looking blue and white Corvette car sitting there, doors wide open, keys in the ignition, nobody around. I raised my voice. I said, officer, I believe that's my car. And, the fellow that was in the garage, he took it out for a test drive. They said, well, why don't we hop in my cruiser? We'll go down there and we'll get your car. Imagine you want it back, don't you? I said, yes, sir, I do. We went down to where the car was parked on the shoulder of the road. And as I opened the door and looked inside, the driver's side and the passenger side, everything looked pretty normal, except there were all of these long brown hairs all over the place. And it's kind of like somebody had a really, really shaggy dog of sorts. Officer said, well, you got the registration and such, you're the rightful owner, might as well get on your way. And with that, I thanked him and headed down the road. I will tell you folks to this day that I will never forget those words of wisdom that my father drilled into my head as a young driver. The most important one, though, I remember in particular, never stop looking at your gas gauge, because you may run out of gas at the worst possible time and place, and that would not be a good thing. Thank you.
We're sorry to give you a short period of time, but it's yours. Go ahead.
Perfect. Yeah. If we're running over, by the way, I can.
No. Go right ahead.
Sure. Also, shout outs for that story. Man, the delivery on that was incredible. So snaps to you, sir. I also am not a big fan of tarantulas. So I feel like we connect on that level. I have a short story from my time living in Portland, Maine. I am not a professional storyteller by any means, but I dabble here and there. And this is a true story. There's actually a silly little viral YouTube video that people keep sending me, my friends on Facebook, because the owner of the store where this happened put it up as an example of human kindness. And it's really cool. So I feel lucky to have experienced this. And I'll walk you guys kind of through the setting. So this was back in like 2011. I was, around 21 at the time, living in Portland, Maine for the summer. I was interning at the State Theater, which is like the coolest performance venue in the state of Maine, right? I was super excited. I got to see Dweezil Zappa, Emmylou Harris, Elvis Costello, all these famous musicians come through. And, I was a hobbyist when it came to playing music, and I thought to myself, gosh, where better but Portland, Maine to find myself a new acoustic guitar, right? And so, I'm working at this point at the Slice Bar, making, I don't know, a fistful of dollars for my troubles. Like, I'm not flush with cash, but I have a little money, right? I've saved it up dutifully, and I know, like, okay, I have a budget of about $200 I can spend. I should be able to get like a reasonable quality acoustic guitar for this kind of money, right? And so I go into this place called Guitar Grave. It's this pawn shop in downtown Portland, and it's great. It's kind of like your classic, slightly divey, like worn-in pawn shop. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in the store, right? And I meander back to the sort of the last section of the store in the back, and there's all these guitars there. And I'm looking and I see it, right? This acoustic guitar. It is a Sigma. For those of you who are guitar players, you may know that is the subsidiary company of C.F. Martin & Co., the famous Martin guitars, of course. So Sigma is like their version of Fender has Squier, Martin has Sigma, right? And I go, oh my God, this Sigma guitar, right? I'm playing it, I'm looking at it. It comes with a hard shell case. I'm sold, right? I was like, this is the one. And I take the guitar and I find a clerk. I'm like, hey man, I'm ready to buy this guitar. And it turns out, so I had thought the guitar was exactly $200, like right on the dot, right? And I don't know if it was a clerical issue or if it was like there was tax added that I didn't know about. I was also a kid, so there's that, But I bring the guitar up fully meaning to buy it, and the guy rings me up and he goes, "That'll be $220." And I was like, "Oh," because again, as we've established earlier in the story, I only had $200 on me. So we've reached a bit of a conundrum, right? And, I was going to put it on layaway. The guy was starting to explain to me how to do that. Out of nowhere, this woman just pops up and she says, she looks at us and she had clearly heard me just nerding out about this guitar. I was like beyond excited, right? This was the only thing I had ever wanted as far as instruments were concerned that she could tell. And she goes, $20 for the boy and his guitar? And the guy was like, yeah, $20. And she just looked at me and she said, pay it forward. And she took out $20, handed it to the guy, and that was it. And I had that guitar for years after that. I used it when I played in a band in Boston. I recorded a song in the studio with it. And actually her sister found me on Facebook when the video went viral, So I actually got to talk to her sister about that like years later. It's a very cool thing that happened in my life. And it restored a lot of, it's like a random act of kindness. You hear those stories all the time. Like, this is a real thing that happened that I lived through. And I will never forget, Judy was the name of this woman who selflessly gave $20 so I could have that acoustic guitar. And I went on to, use it in a band. And it was really cool. So that is my little glimmer of human kindness story. Shout outs to Judy. So let's hear it for her. But thank you guys for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Owen. That's a heartwarming story. And these folks don't know you like I do, but you are a wonderful guy. And we're so glad that you're with us tonight. And we hope that you'll be able to join us again in the future.
Thank you, Uncle John. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody.
Well, folks, that wraps it up tonight. We want to thank you all for being here with us, and we want to invite you to come back for our September concert that will be right after Labor Day, the first Wednesday of September. And until then, we hope that you will all stay healthy, and whether you're in a part of the country that needs water, we hope you get it, or in a part of the country that would love to get rid of the floods that you've been having. We hope that works out also. So thank you again from San Antonio Storytellers.